This is it, the final week of the fantasy football regular season. It is the last chance to make a push for a playoff spot if you already haven't locked one up. It's the last chance to maybe lock in a first round bye. It's the last week of NFL bye weeks as well. So it's a huge one this week. We're going to make sure we get those lineups set proper. I'm John Macri, and for this episode of the PFF Fantasy Podcast, IDP edition, I will be going over all of the IDP relevant information for all the positions, all the games as we do, and hopefully help you make this final week of the fantasy regular season a good one. So let's get it. All right, this week obviously is crucial. I'm going to do my best to not F it up for you guys. I'm locked in. We're going to talk about a lot of defensive players today. So as always, I hope you guys are all locked in. I understand, that this could end up being the final fantasy week of football, or a final fantasy, if you will, for some of you. So we're going to do our best to get it right. Make sure that it's not the last week for you, and that you can join us in the fantasy playoffs next week. Obviously, everybody's not going to make it. I imagine we'll start to lose some folks, but hopefully you all will get in. And I was blown away by how many people were actually watching this show before the Thanksgiving games last week. That was crazy. I did not expect over 1,000 people to be in here making sure to get the information before those games. So that was mind-blowing to me. So thank you all for jumping in and watching. I hope that you Americans all had a very good Thanksgiving, because now the focus solely becomes on making the fantasy playoffs. And for those of you who are here, as always, if you can hype, subscribe to the channel, all those kinds of things that help a ton. And I greatly appreciate if you want to get access to the PFF IDP rankings, player grades, IDP report, fantasy IDP report, man zone coverage report, red zone report, all those kinds of things, all the lock content, the player grades, rankings, all that stuff that we have over on pff.com. You can do so now. And the Black Friday sale might be over, but we still have some savings here for you guys. If you use the promo code HOLIDAY30, you'll get 30% off a PFF Plus subscription. So make sure to utilize that if you are looking to get locked in here for the fantasy playoffs. And before we get into the games, I wanted to ask you guys, or bring it up. I didn't know when else to bring it. We'll do it right before the games here. You guys have been so awesome and kind of supportive all year long. So I wanted to see if there would be an interest in a week 16 live stream version of this show, I guess, right? I was going to do it for the final week of the fantasy season, week 17, but that's also Christmas week, so not ideal for anyone. So I'm thinking week 16 instead. I have no idea if anyone would ever show up live or how it will go, but I'd prep the episode as kind of a game by game chat, breakdown as usual. Then anyone watching who wants to ask questions or comment or chat or yell at me for something I might have gotten wrong and ruined your fantasy season, you can absolutely do that, and I'd find a way to make it work. So anyways, let me know if anyone would want that. It would probably be the Thursday morning, right when this episode typically releases. We'll probably do it around 10 a.m. Eastern time, if I had to guess. And if there's even an interest, then we'll do it. If not, if it's a terrible idea, then also let me know, and we'll keep things the same as usual. But just wanted to find a new way, I guess, to interact with you guys, since again, you've been so supportive of the show all year. Thought it could be fun, but anyways, that's week 16. Right now, we're focused on week 14. So let's get to the games. As always, timestamps will be in the episode description, so you could find the games you're looking for. But let's start with Thursday Night Football, the Dallas Cowboys and the Detroit Lions. So Dallas's linebackers, obviously the kind of main focus recently here, because there is still a heavy rotation, but DeMarvion Overshown might just be separating himself from the pack a little bit, right? So Overshown actually played 70% of the snaps last week, while nobody else on the Cowboys played more than 55%. So I think we probably see that role slowly continue to increase for Overshown. And, Logan Wilson, Kenneth Murray, they'll still scrap it out for that other spot. I'd probably still avoid those two if possible. But at least for deeper leagues, since it is a good tackle matchup here against the lineups, the Lions, a great tackle matchup, I think Overshown can be a viable option in deeper formats this week. Dallas's defensive line. So Jadeveon Clowney, he had 2 sacks last week. He only played 44% of the snap. So it's going to be really hard to trust that. Ezaraku, it played 61%, as the clear leader for that edge group, but he's purely a volume play. And then Quinnen Williams, he's still the top DT required option here, but he's been pretty quiet for IDP purposes recently, though he has been playing a lot better than his production has showed, right? He had another 6 pressures last week. So 21 total pressures since joining the Cowboys is really good. And it's a nice tackle matchup at the very least this week to boost his production floor. Jared Goff has been taking more sacks recently, and that interior of the Lions offensive line right now has been kind of awful in terms of pass blocking. So I like Quinnen again this week. Hopefully he can turn those pressures into sacks here on Thursday night. And then Dallas's defensive backs, a good matchup for the cornerbacks, specifically Deron Bland, who gets work in the slot and stays on in non-nickel situations. So he's had more poor matchups here recently than not, but this one should be better for his IDP potential. So don't mind Deron Bland. The safeties, it's a neutral matchup. Malik Hooker, he actually ended up getting banged up last week. He might be questionable for this week. I don't really care. Again, Malik Hooker, we're not starting most leagues. Donovan Wilson, also kind of just a fine option. Nothing special, to a point where we're, expecting a great or even bad game from him. Just kind of expecting him to be on the field and put up average production. For Detroit, their linebackers, Jack Campbell, look, he's been a top 5 IDP linebacker this year. I'd expect him to stay in IDP lineups every week, so nothing changes there. Anzalone actually had a nice game last week. That was also a great tackle matchup. Average matchup this week, so we'll still expect Anzalone to be kind of a low-end start relative to the rest of the full-time linebackers. And Derek Barnes, he only played 73% of snaps last week and 44% of them on the edge, right? So for those sleeper leagues, I'd say he's more of kind of a fringe DL2, DL3 this week in still tackle-heavy formats more than anything. Detroit's defensive line, it's Aiden Hutchinson. He had another nice tackle game last week, so that was good to see. Maybe some positive regression there over the last 2 games in terms of tackle rate. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to get home with a sack or really much at all as a pass rusher against the Packers, who continue to be one of the tougher pass rush matchups this year. The Cowboys, they're not an easy matchup either, mostly because Dak is one of the best in the league at not letting pressures turn into sacks. So Hutch is gonna have to be quick to get to Dak this week because he should have no problems winning his reps against those Cowboys offensive tackles. It's just getting to Dak in time is really the problem. So still starting Hutch as like a DL1 just on the lower end this week. Detroit's defensive backs, it sounds like it'll be another week of Thomas Harper in for Kirby Joseph this week and at safety next to Brian Branch. Branch remains a starter in a neutral matchup. Harper is fine if needed. The only thing with Harper, as was the case with Kirby Joseph, is that he's playing exclusively deep. Like 86% of his snaps were from a deep alignment last week. So he's a low-end option for IDP. Amik Robertson and DJ Reed also get a great matchup with the Cowboys, giving up the most tackles per game to the cornerback position. So that's been the case almost all year with the Dallas offense. So they've stayed a great matchup. Robertson and Reed are the full-time options here since Terry and Arnold went to IR. So should have some solid streaming weeks here to target those guys. All right, Miami and the Jets is the first Sunday game. Let's start with Miami's linebackers, Jordan Brooks and Tyrell Dodson, solid as usual. They get a neutral matchup this week, so I'd expect Brooks to kind of be the high-end play again and lead the way. Might move Dodson to more of that mid-range LB2 for matchups like this, but definitely both still startable. We've been starting these guys all year, so yeah, you know who they are at this point. Miami's defensive back. So there was an interesting shift with the Dolphins safeties last week. And it's kind of a trend we're starting to see more across the league where Miami actually deployed 3 near full-time safeties with Minkah Fitzpatrick, Ashton Davis, and Afatu Melifonwu all getting significant playing time. Minkah basically operated at like purely out of the slot. 75% of his snaps were in the slot, which was a season high for him. So if we assume that usage holds, while this is a bad matchup for safeties, it's at least slightly better matchup for cornerbacks, which is where Minka is playing from in that CB alignment. So not like he's a high end play this week, but just worth noting that shift in usage because, yeah, where else are you going to get that info? Anyways, Miami's defensive line, Chop Robinson, he got 1.5 sacks last week. So that was great. And he actually got more work on early downs as well. So he's still more of that boom bust IDP option, but not the worst pass rush matchup this week for those like deep leagues, since he is at least trending up ever so slightly. Bradley Chubb and Zach Sealer are still the preferred options in the non-shallow leagues if you need them. We'll go to the Jets now. The Jets linebackers, unfortunately, yeah, both of the Jets linebackers, Jamie Sherwood, Quincy Williams, they kind of get a shit matchup here against the Fish. And it's been worse here recently because Miami's offense is gross. They just have not given up much for our IDPs. Sherwood still the preferred option in that kind of LB2 range because he's been mostly effective, though he disappeared last week and Quincy had a better game. But on the season as a whole, Sherwood is the more trustworthy option for IDP. So I've got him in that kind of LB2 range. Quincy more of a low-end LB3. Jets defensive line, Jermaine Johnson and Will McDonald. So this is a positive matchup here against a bad Miami pass blocking unit. And of course, Tua Tagovailoa, who will take 1 or 2 sacks per game, if not more. So Johnson and McDonald's they're really kind of the ones that I think will have the best chance to get there, but they'll purely be streaming options if you need them. Jets defensive backs, we'll see what happens with Tony Adams because he had a nice game last week, mostly thanks to a sack, but he also only played the first half before getting hurt. So they sound optimistic that he'll play this week, and his usage is slightly better than Malachi Moore's, though they're kind of interchangeable. Either way, both guys have been a little bit better recently, and it's a good matchup. It could make them streamable this week if you need them. Isaiah Oliver would be Tony Adams' replacement if you need him. And then Brandon Stevens is a perfectly fine CB required option this week in a neutral matchup. He's been getting enough tackles to be usable, though. All right, on to Pittsburgh and Baltimore. The Pittsburgh linebackers, let's start there because the Patrick Queen revenge game might be off. No, sorry, I can't. We all know that he wasn't going to exact any revenge. If anything, he'd probably act as a double agent and conveniently miss 6 or 7 tackles against Derrick Henry and Lamar Jackson. Yeah, but Queen, he's likely to miss this game, which means that Peyton Wilson should, I say with emphasis because the Steelers might still hate this poor bastard, but he should play a full-time role with Queen out. Wilson wore the dot last week once Queen left the game. So that's the data that we're going to trust. If Queen is out, then Wilson, he should at least be a strong starting option. Like, it's not the best matchup, but Wilson has been about like 5 percentage points more efficient as a tackler than Queen, to the point where Wilson, despite playing, I think, fewer or more than 200 fewer snaps than Patrick Queen, he's scoring better for IDP than him as well. Like, it's amazing. I love it. And I hope that Wilson gets a chance to show that he can be a full-time linebacker here for a few weeks. We'll likely see Malik Harrison play the LB2 spot, and then Cole Holcomb mix in as well. But great sign for Peyton Wilson's IDP value this week. Again, not the best matchup, but we expect Wilson to overcome this kind of matchup much more than we would Patrick Queen to overcome this matchup. Pittsburgh's defensive line. So Alex Highsmith did in fact return last week. That knocked Nick Herbig right back down to a 39% snap share, while TJ Watt and Highsmith played about 3/4 of the snaps. So Watt had kind of a dud game last week against the Bills, and the Bills did do a nice job adjusting from the massacre at the hands of the Texans pass rush. But even still, Watt had another one of those kind of very down games in terms of his pass rush metrics. We've talked about that a few times this year, the declining pass rush metrics of TJ Watt. But I do like this matchup quite a bit for Watt, for Highsmith, for Cam Hayward. The Ravens offensive line has struggled, and Lamar is taking sacks at a high rate. So there's high end potential here with this group to target if you got them. And then Pittsburgh's defensive backs. Last week, it was a good matchup for Joey Porter Jr. He had a nice 8-tackle game, but this week, this is the worst cornerback tackle matchup. So I'd avoid him this week if you can. Jalen Ramsey, Kyle Duggar, they're at safety. They're fine, but nothing kind of ideal lining up for them to have great IDP games this week. For Baltimore, they're linebackers. So Roquan, obviously, we're leaving in the large majority of IDP lineups. No concerns there. Even in a neutral matchup, he's fine. Teddy Buchanan, he's the deep league option, still kind of hovering around that 70 to 75% of snaps range. Baltimore's defensive backs. Last week, we talked about really liking Marlon Humphrey, and he had a great game. 9 tackles and a sack for him. This week, he gets the second worst tackle matchup for cornerbacks, sadly. So not that I hate Humphrey this week because he's been so good and there are so few great cornerback IDP options, but just kind of tempering expectations this week. We know how volatile the cornerback position can be. And same thing with like Kyle Hamilton and the safeties, really. It's a poor matchup for them as well. So, I'm going to consistently trust Kyle Hamilton over the rest of the group since #usage, right? But even still, we're not expecting a high-end game from the safeties this week. And lastly, Baltimore's defensive line, not a great matchup for the pass rushers here either. Like this is just a really kind of bland and boring matchup here for our IDPs. Nothing to get excited about at all. Like looking at the screen here, just a bunch of red and one yellow bar, like just boring, nothing exciting. So yeah, like Travis Jones is still a fine kind of volume-based option for DT required leagues. Mike Green and Draymond Jones, kind of the same thing on the edge, but I wouldn't feel excited about putting either player in my lineup this week. Maybe they do something, but yeah, I'm not going to beat myself up if they end up, with great games and they're on my bench or anything like that. On to the Colts and the Jaguars. So Indianapolis's defensive backs. We'll start there. Actually, you know what? No. Let's start with the linebackers because Zaire Franklin on a 3-game double-digit tackle streak after not hitting double-digit tackles until before the streak happened. Are we finally getting some production from this? I would call him a disgraced former LB1. Possibly. Like I almost want to trust him again, but we'll see how he does this week in a poor matchup, right? Against the Jaguars, they rank 28th in tackles per game to the linebacker position. So these have typically been matchups where like Jermaine Pratt outproduces Zaire. So it'll be a good test. Pratt's still kind of around that 84% of snap range. That's been the norm for him. No sign of Jalen Carley's last week. He wasn't activated off IR yet. I still don't really believe that he'll take over or really affect Pratt's snaps too much, but obviously we won't know for sure until we see it. Until then, I'm fine starting Pratt kind of with confidence in those deeper leagues and starting Zaire with, I guess, extreme trepidation in shallower formats. Yeah, we'll see how he does if he can keep the streak going, but not the best matchup here for Zaire Franklin to keep that double-digit sacks or double-digit tackle streak going. Indianapolis's defensive line, it was a down game for Laiatu Latu last week after a great game against the Chiefs the week before. He's not in that really like consistent kind of locked in territory just yet, but he's certainly playable in a matchup like this one against the Jaguars. He will line up against both offensive tackles. Jags offensive tackles aren't exactly brick walls. Plus Trevor Lawrence will definitely take some sacks. So he'll be in that kind of edge 2 range again for me this week. And now the Indianapolis defensive backs, because it is a great matchup for Nick Cross and Cam Bynum, specifically Cross, who we always like and are leaving in lineups. But the Jaguars given up obviously the second most tackles per game to the safety position. So Bynum at least becomes more interesting here since he's been that true deep safety this year and in much more matchup dependent. So he'll be a streaming option if you need him. It's not a great matchup on paper here for the cornerbacks, which is interesting because we don't typically get such a big discrepancy between tackles per game to the cornerback position and to the safety position from the same team. But that's kind of what the Jags have given us here so far this year. So no Sauce Gardner this week. It'll be Charvarius Ward and Mekhi Blackman. We don't have to start them, but they're going to get some playing time. Not a great matchup for either of them. And that includes Kenny Moore as well. Not a great matchup for him either. On to Jacksonville. Let's start with Josh Hines Alan. And before I even get into the actual analysis, it seems that I have to issue an apology to the entire country of the United States of America because my idiot brain tricked me into doubting that there wasn't Heinz ketchup in the US. This was so obviously wrong. And the fact that I, didn't stop myself or correct myself on stream, it's shameful, to be honest. And I have scheduled a seppuku for myself following the fantasy season. It's really the only correct course of action to take at this point. I'm an idiot. And my ketchup and product geography is shit tier. And now you all know it. Doesn't matter that I was right about the positive sack regression for Josh Hines Allen in the second half of the season. That cannot cover the fact that I've shamed myself and my family with such stupidity in forgetting that Hines originated in the frickin' States. So seppuku is scheduled after the season, though. We still got some work to do. All right, enough of that nonsense. Josh Hines Allen now has 5.5 sacks over his last 5 games, and rewarding IDP managers' patience, right? Which you love to see. This week, it's going to be one of his tougher matchups for sure against a very good Colts offensive line and Daniel Jones, who shut out Will Anderson and Danielle Hunter last week. So not to say he's not startable, because talent can definitely overcome, but I would brace for a lower output this week. Jacksonville's linebackers, it wasn't Foyer's best showing last week. And go figure that Devin Lloyd was the more efficient tackler for the first time this year after updating his abysmal tackle rate last week. I guess the motivational powers struck again, as he said, I'll show you my geographically challenged Canuck. Still Devin Lloyd. He's really still just the deeper league option. He's not playing a full-time role. The tackle rate still really poor, but the big plays, they've buoyed his score. But in a poor tackle matchup, they'll both kind of come in a little lower than their usual ranking. So more of a LB2 for Foyer, I guess, more of a LB4-5 for Devin Lloyd. Jags defensive backs, basically a neutral matchup for this group. This is a neutral group, to be honest, looking at the names here. Andrew Wingard, Antonio Johnson. It makes sense that they're on the Jags because they are both just a guy. Jordan Lewis, probably the most interesting of the group because he'll play in the slot and he'll get those full-time snaps as well. It's not a great cornerback tackle matchup, but the Colts are about league average in 11 personnel rate. So Lewis is most preferred for CB required leagues. Monteric Brown, if you're nasty, but I'd rather not this week. Okay, Saints and Buccaneers. Let's start with New Orleans DBs because there's actually some change kind of worth going over. Justin Reed suffered an injury that could potentially cost him some time. Now, unfortunately, that did not lead to a clear replacement. And what happened was that the team ended up rotating at the position more than they had all seasons. And that included Jonas Sanker. So Sanker still led the way, but it was with 76% of snaps. He didn't play every drive. Jordan Howden and Terrell Burgess both got work as well. Howden played 66% and Burgess played 54%. So keeping in mind, Reed got hurt immediately. I think he played like 2 snaps before getting hurt. So this was a designed rotation, which is pretty annoying, right? Like it's a good matchup where I think Sanker can have value in deeper leagues just because he also gets decent usage in the box, but I'm not trusting kind of the others if there's going to be a rotation again. Sanker is purely for deeper leagues right now. New Orleans linebackers, Demaryius Davis gets an average matchup. He's a fine start still. Nothing new with him. And then nothing new with Pete Werner as well, who's still stuck below 60% of snaps. So no, thank you. Saints defensive line, Chase Young playing well this year. He picked up another sack last week. Meanwhile, Carl Granderson is slowly turning into dust as his sackless streak is now at 8 games, and Young has passed him in total sacks for the year now, despite missing like half the season. So really, it's just Chase Young in consideration with this defensive line these days. Now we'll see. I mean, Granderson, I would say completely off the radar for now. He's probably going to go off because, it'll be on our benches or on waiver wires. But because, it just feels like he's lost all starting value at this point if he hadn't lost it a few weeks ago. Chase Young, the only one really worth considering here. On to Tampa Bay. start with the DBs, because Tyke Smith, he was a victim of the bad matchup last week. Unfortunately, thought he might be able to overcome, as he had in previous bad matchups, but that was not the case, sadly. Amazingly, it was Antoine Winfield who overcame with a bit better game, but nothing different usage-wise between the two, or anything to be concerned about going forward. Still a below-average matchup this week for the Tampa Bay safeties, so maybe I'll chill on the Tyke ranking a little bit this week. Still leaving him as a top 12 DB, but kind of on the lower end of that range. Winfield's still more of a safety too. The Saints are also a top five team in 11 personnel rate. So Jacob Parrish is in play this week. Unfortunately, Parrish did not get a 100% snap roll like he did the week before. We talked about, him playing 100% of snaps against the Rams, I think it was, and seeing if that would hold for him. It did. That wasn't the case, but there was at least some hope that it might be. He still played a solid 77% of snaps as that primary nickel corner in a good matchup, and he was fine. It'd probably be something very similar from him this week, if not slightly more snaps. So he can be useful in CB required leagues. Tampa Bay's linebackers, Servassier Dennis, he had a nice game last week, led the team in tackles. Levante David, another poor tackle showing. I don't know if you guys remember, back in probably October, I think it was, maybe I did it in November as well, talking about Levante's really poor tackle rate and, how he was while he was a top 12 IDP linebacker at the time in scoring, he was kind of bound to fall out of that range as he regressed in those big plays, which were kind of keeping him up there. It just wasn't sustainable given his tackle rate. And now several weeks later, he's sitting at LB 30 in scoring, and the tackle rate just hasn't improved much. Even Servassier Dennis has actually surpassed him in scoring. So shout out to the Dennis system for working against Levante. But yeah, it's too bad. I love Levante, obviously one of my all-time favorite IDPs, but he's kind of just a weekly LB3 at this point. Hopefully that was a little motivation. We'll see. But both guys really in that kind of LB3 range for me this week, to be honest. Tampa Bay's D-line, Yaya Diaby has been solid lately, finally tied his 6 sack total from last year. I think there's still some positive sack regression due for him in these final weeks. Gets a good matchup this week to add to that sack total, so I don't mind yes, Diaby as a potential streamer this week. Also, Anthony Nelson is no longer in that volume-heavy bucket of options. He dropped way down to just 30% of the snaps with Hassan Reddick back after, I guess he was out a month. It's been about a month now since he's been gone. So, and Reddick went immediately back to a 77% snap share. So he'll be that kind of volume-based option right now in a good matchup here. Seattle and Atlanta is next. Seattle's linebackers. We'll start there. Ernest freaking Jones with not one, but 2 picks in week 13, one of which was obviously a pick 6. It hasn't been an LB1 year for Ernest Jones, but after that game, he's jumped to LB4 at the position in points per game, something like that. So those are obviously incredibly rare and unpredictable performances. Obviously, of course, if we knew Max Brosmer was going to be the worst quarterback of all time, then that would have helped. That pick 6 was nothing if not hilarious. But yeah, no Brosmer this week. So we'll focus on just tackle potential for Ernest this week. It is a slightly below average matchup, unfortunately, but Ernest is a full-time linebacker, obviously overcame a poor matchup last week. So I'm sure anyone who had him benched might be skittish about benching him again. We'll see. So yeah, he's a fine play, as he's typically been. Drake Thomas played just 60% of snaps last week, but part of that was because there was garbage time. So he really was about 70% of the snaps. He'll still be a deeper league option. Seattle's defensive backs, always kind of a lot to sort with these guys. Nick Emenwari's role in the slot and in the box, that's going to make him kind of our top IDP option. I would be happy to start him again this week if you have him. And I did just see the notification that Julian Love is expected back this week. We were kind of thinking it was going to happen last week, but they were at least designated to return to practice. So Julian Love has a chance to be back this week. It doesn't seem like he's suffered a setback or anything like that. We will check the practice reports as the week goes on. But if Love isn't back this week, then it is another week of Ty Okada. That could be fine. Devin Witherspoon also remains kind of a solid CB required option, getting a little work in the slot still, just not as much as he was when Emanwari wasn't in the lineup. And then Seattle's defensive line, Leonard Williams, Byron Murphy, those are the top options. They've been great. Not an ideal pass rush matchup against a good Falcons offensive line. Kirk Cousins has been decent at avoiding sacks so far, even if not Michael Penix levels of good in that category. DeMarcus Lawrence has been productive, but that rotation at the edge is very heavy right now with Uchenna Nwosu, Boye Mafe, Derek Hall, and obviously DeMarcus Lawrence all kind of sharing a role and playing around 50-ish% of the snaps. I know Lawrence, he had the lowest snaps of the bunch last week, but that was partly due to garbage time as well. So not too concerned about that. Just don't love these heavy rotations in tougher matchups. Let's go to Atlanta now, and let's start with their defensive line. I think this group has kind of earned the right to be talked about first because of these rookies specifically have kind of leveled up that defensive line. They've added some prestige to the formerly NPC coded D line of the Falcons. So James Pierce Jr. specifically now on a 4-game sack streak. He's been effective here since we reached the double-digit weeks of the season, basically, which is what we like to see from our rookies, right? Not just the 4.5 sacks over that stretch, but 16 total pressures as well. Jalen Walker's also looked good. He didn't get home last week, but we're seeing more promise from these two than we have from any Atlanta defensive lineman in a long time. So there's hope there. Maybe not this week, but long-term at least. Sam Darnold is the opposition this week. He's still been an absolute pain in the ass to take down this season. So would not be surprised to see Pierce's sack streak end this week, but some good stuff from him recently anyways. Atlanta's linebackers, Caden Ellis, Divine Diablo, both playable as usual. If you've been playing them, I still prefer Diablo in a vacuum if you're presented with the choice, just because he does play that more typical linebacker role, and he's usually in a better position to rack up tackles. Ellis does have more big play upside since he'll play on the edge and he'll rush the passer more, but that also hurts his tackle rate again. So, just something to keep in mind there. Atlanta's defensive backs, Sweet D. Alford gets a shit matchup, unfortunately, as the team's nickel corner. Seattle ranks 31st in 11 personnel rate, so we'll avoid Sweet D where possible this week. The safeties are fine, as usual. Xavier Watts, Jesse Bates, both solid most weeks. All right, on to Chicago and Green Bay. And I mean, we got to start with the Chicago linebackers because right now that linebacker core is made up of scraps with so many injuries. It's crazy. I think that's a pregnant woman they have as a potential call-up from the practice squad at some point if needed. That's a Community reference for those who have watched that show. But yeah, Tremaine Edmonds on injured reserve. TJ Edwards has been banged up. Noah Sewell has been banged up. Ruben Hippolyte has been hurt. They were down to DeMarco Jackson and I got to say this name again, Amen Ogbongbemiga last week, and neither of them did much in what was an awful matchup, to be fair. This week, hopefully, at least TJ Edwards or Rigatoni Sewell is back because, nobody wants to be plugging in DeMarco or Ogbong into lineups, especially since Ogbong only played 52% of the snaps last week. So at least with TJ Edwards and Sewell, we should get full-time snaps for both of those guys, and it is a great matchup against the Packers. So it would be nice for them this to be the week that they come back. Otherwise, I guess have your finger on the DeMarco Jackson trigger if TJ Edwards or Sewell can't go this week, because we like this matchup a lot, but he would be the only full-time option if both of those guys are out again. Chicago's defensive back. So interesting stuff last week with the Bears DBs and Kyler Gordon and Jalen Johnson returning. Neither player in their return played full-time, which you definitely expect, I think, from Jalen Johnson, to potentially get up to a full-time role as soon as this week. So it's easy to assume that he was being eased in after basically not playing this year. But I don't know that means the same for Kyler Gordon. We'll have to find out here. It's possible that he was also eased in at 67% of snaps. I don't really know because Chauncey Gardner-Johnson still played 100% of the snaps. So that was encouraging for Gardner-Johnson. The other part of it too, when you play your LB2 at 50% of snaps, that opens up more for some of these defensive backs, right? So we can see what happens if TJ Edwards and Noah Sewell are back in the lineup. They both play full time unless they change things. They put Sewell at 50%, but that opened up a lot more snaps for those DBs, like Kyler Gordon playing 67% and Gardner Johnson playing 100%. So we'll definitely monitor this week. If you have them, if you have Gardner Johnson, he's definitely more playable than Kyler Gordon right now. But I'm mostly okay just kind of holding on both of these guys right now, monitoring the situation, keeping an eye on it here. Jaquan Brisker, Kevin Byard are fine. They're fine options. They played full time. There's nothing to be concerned about there. It's just Gardner Johnson, Kyler Gordon, and the linebackers that we'll have to keep an eye on. Chicago's defensive line. It's Montez Sweat. That's the only one. Unfortunately, he draws the difficult Jordan Love matchup this week. So as solid as he's been, he's kind of a fringe edge 2, edge 3 this week. Green Bay. We'll start with the linebackers. I don't know that we'll get another Isaiah McDuffie game this week, assuming Quaker is back in the lineup. He missed the last 2 games with that stinger / neck, whatever it is. That being said, McDuffie has been awesome if we do need him. But yeah, if Quay Walker is back, then we'll just expect him to go back to a full-time role and McDuffie just, that part-time role that basically isn't relevant for IDP. And then Edgerrin Cooper is also full-time. Now, Cooper, he hasn't really been great this year, which is definitely frustrating since Quaker and McDuffie have almost consistently been the better options every single week. It doesn't mean that Cooper can't be that guy again, because full-time linebacker equals good for IDP. So in a good matchup like this, I like both of the Packers linebackers this week if you got them. Just probably an edge to either Quaker or McDuff over Coop, sadly. Green Bay's defensive line, Micah Parsons is just a dog. 12.5 sacks on the year, at least 12 sacks in every season of his career so far. I can't believe that people complain about this dude's down games, because it's so hard to find that level of consistency at defensive line for IDP. So enjoy it if you have it. Tolerate the low output games if they happen, because it won't be long before he hits on that upside that we're hoping for from him. Rashawn Gary, not someone I'm willing to trust in lineups at this point. He's just gone completely cold. And it is a tougher matchup against Caleb Williams and the Bears. And then unfortunately, Devontae Wyatt suffered a season-ending ankle injury. So that is one less good DT required option for us. So a major bummer there that we won't have Devontae Wyatt anymore. Green Bay's defensive backs, Xavier McKinney, just fine. IDP option most weeks. That doesn't really change this week. Him and Evan Williams, both kind of the same. It's a good CB required matchup, which is basically Carrington Valentine, not so much. And then Keyshawn Nixon is better. So that Keyshawn Nixon is the one that we'll trust the most. Washington and Minnesota. Start with the Washington linebackers, and go figure, right? In a week where the Frankie Louvu upside was potentially at its lowest potential in a super difficult pass rush matchup against Denver, he gets a sack. So still had an awful 4% tackle rate in that game, but he finally hit on one of those big plays. But yeah, nothing changes with him. We know who he is. Funny enough, this actually is a good pass rush matchup because JJ McCarthy, aka 9, is back under center. So maybe there's hope, for maybe a mini streak here for Louvu, but again, more still of a deeper league option. And then Bobby Wagner remains the top option here. Washington's DBs, Will Harris returned last week and he cut down Jeremy Reeves' role. So I'm assuming that also ended that stupid alternating lead safety nonsense as well. Harris only played 79% of snaps last week, but good chance that he'll go up to 100%. And obviously that box heavy role is exactly what we're targeting him for. 55% of his snaps in the box in his return. So yes, please, we definitely love that. Unfortunately, the Vikings continue to be an absolute black hole for safety tackles, and they're getting worse too. They're allowing 8.5 safety tackles per game on the year, but just 5.7 per game over the last 3. That is insanely low. So Washington safeties will be a tough bet to make this week. I would probably avoid them this week and look elsewhere. Washington's defensive line, it's Daron Payne for DT required leagues, just because 9 is at quarterback. But God, this group is sad. Yeah, I don't think there's anybody else. I remember when Washington had Chase Young, Montez Sweat, Jonathan Allen, and Daron Payne, and they look like a sick defensive line. Well, now it is literally and figuratively just Payne. So yeah, it's not a good one here. Minnesota's defensive line, let's go there next. Dallas Turner had 2 sacks last week with Jonathan Grenard in the lineup, but touched on this in the IDP report. It's probably more due to Grenard just kind of being eased in. He only played 22% of snaps in his return. So that did give Turner more work. He played 70%. I don't think it's crazy to assume that Grenard's workload increases and Turner's role decreases the next few weeks. And that's just been the pecking order under Brian Flores here. So just be cautious about starting either guy this week. And really any of the Minnesota edges. I know Andrew Van Ginkel included in that because, again, that role where he's dropping into coverage a ton isn't really ideal. Yes, he got a sack last week, but that was also his only pressure of the game. And we know the pass rush metrics for him are pretty mid. So he's a risky play most weeks. Minnesota's linebackers, we got a big Eric Wilson game last week. He had like 4 TFLs, a sack, 11 tackles. He's another one, though, where we should always kind of be bracing for fluctuating production because of his role on the edge where he's rushing the passer. It's not too dissimilar, actually, to the guy that we were just talking about, Frankie Louvu. That being said, it's a nice matchup this week for Wilson. He should be usable again, but Blake Cashman is definitely our preferred weekly option. Minnesota's defensive backs, Josh Metellus, Harrison Smith, they're fine options here. We prefer Metellus for sure. Byron Murphy at cornerback, if you want to play a cornerback in this one, neutral matchup there as well. All right, on to Tennessee and Cleveland. Tennessee's linebackers, let's start there. I highlighted this in the IDP report as well. We've talked about it a ton on this show, but the difference in efficiency between Cedric the Gray and Cody Wetfarton is objectively hilarious. Like, even just last week, Gray had a 16% tackle rate and Barton had a 3% tackle rate. That has kind of been the microcosm of the season with these two. Barton has been god-awful, 8.2% tackle rate on the year. And Cedric the Gray, 17.5% tackle rate. That is a massive difference to the point where Gray is a top 12 IDP linebacker and Barton is like LB 41. And that's with Barton playing every single defensive snap possible this season and over 100 more snaps than Gray on the year. So you guys already know this. We've covered it a ton, but yeah, I have fun with the comparisons between these two. So just start Cedric the Gray from this linebacker duo and you will be fine. Tennessee's defensive backs. There was a shift here. This was one of those 3 safety changes that I kind of referenced happening earlier because Xavier Woods returned to the lineup last week, which we thought might hurt the rookie Kevin Winston Jr.'s playing time. But what the team did was they moved Winston into the slot role, and that led to Amani Hooker and Xavier Woods just playing safety, and it let Winston keep an every down role. So potentially another one of those 3 safety teams right now. And Winston is kind of the one to emerge with a nice slot heavy role. So he'd be the top option for me from this from that group for this week and probably every week, assuming that usage holds now going forward. Tennessee's defensive line, Jeffrey Simmons, that is it. It's against the Browns offensive line as well. So I definitely Jeffrey Simmons. The rest are really just dart throws. So I don't trust them. All right, let's talk about Cleveland, their defensive line, specifically the one, the only Myles Garrett. I want to highlight him, not to say, start him or don't start him or anything like that. We don't need start-sit analysis for Myles Garrett. We know that he stays in lineups, but instead, I just want to highlight just how good he's been and how good the matchup is this week. So he has a legitimate chance, I think, to break the sack record this week. He's 19 sacks on the year right now. He leads the league in pass rush grade with a 93.6, leads the league in pass rush win rate at 28%. He is an unstoppable machine right now. That's been the story of his career. But this week, he draws a matchup against the Tennessee Titans where Cam Ward, first of all, at quarterback, been sacked more than any quarterback in the league. He owns the highest pressure to sack conversion rate in the league. But also, he's going to line up primarily against the left tackle, Dan Moore Jr. Dan Moore has allowed 8 sacks this year, He ranks outside the top 50 in pass blocking grades for the position. And Dan Moore has faced Myles Garrett plenty of times in the past. Dan Moore used to play for the Steelers, so these two have seen each other a lot. They have 230 pass rush snaps against each other, for which Myles Garrett has beaten him for a total of 8 sacks, 34 total pressures, owns a 92.6 pass rush grade, and a 27% win rate. I would say that Garrett is essentially a lock for multiple sacks this week, if not potentially breaking the record. I wouldn't be surprised that once the sack props come out, that his line at 2+ sacks is not all like the betting favorite. Like, it's insane how good he's been and just how good this matchup is. So yeah, hopefully you're not playing against him. I know I am in a league where I need a win, so I'm pretty much screwed there. But if you have him, I mean, just expect an explosion from him this week. I realize that this is, me glazing him so much puts us at a risk of potentially jinxing him. But that's how confident I am that Garrett is going to smash again this week. I feel like this might be an unjinxable situation. Unjinxable? Sure. Anyways, that's Myles Garrett. Cleveland linebackers. Unfortunately, really the rest of the Browns IDPs don't get nearly as good of a matchup this week against the Titans. And if Garrett is that one-man wrecking ball, there might be very little scraps left for the rest of this group to do anything with. I'm still starting Schlesinger for the most part. Hopefully he can get maybe a big play in there, but worried, I guess, about the tackling opportunities because the Titans have been so bad. Devin Bush, more for deeper leagues as well. And then the DBs, much less confident in Grant Delpit, Ronnie Hickman. But again, maybe there are some big plays to be had this week. We know Myles Garrett is going to have Cam Ward running for his life, so maybe he makes some bad decisions under pressure. I guess that's the sliver of hope if you're in a desperate spot to start any of the Browns' defensive backs this week. All right, before we go into the rest of the games, I want to let everybody know that this episode is brought to you by Fabric by Gerber Life. Parenting is filled with high-pressure decisions, and it can be difficult to tell if we've made the right choice for our kids' future. But here's a simple decision you can make today that could have a meaningful impact on your kids' future. Opening a UGMA Kids Investment Account with Fabric to start their investment journey early and give them a financial head start. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kids investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. It's all online, and setting up an account could take you just 5 minutes. Get started investing with as little as $1 a day, then manage your child's account and monitor their investments right from your phone. There are no contribution limits, multiple tax advantages, and they're SIPC insured up to $500,000, plus no commission fees and just a low flat monthly maintenance fee. Fabric has partnered with Gerber Life, trusted by millions of families like yours for over 50 years. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/PFFNFL. That's meetfabric.com/PFFNFL. MEETfabric.com/PFFNFL. Portfolios managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors Inc. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Learn more at meetfabric.com. All right, Denver and the Las Vegas Raiders is next. Let's start with the Denver defensive line. I feel like we have to start with this defensive line because Geno Smith is lined up for another train of sacks heading his way in the form of Nick Bonito, Zach Allen, Jonathan Cooper. They are all in a great spot to take advantage of this Raiders bad pass blocking unit. Geno Smith, who's now second worst pressure to sack conversion rate in the league. He's been sacked 15 times over the last 2 games, by far the most in the league. That's likely not going to go away against a very strong Broncos pass rush led by Bonito, right? So Bonito going to be nearly impossible to bench this week. Cooper and Allen definitely should be almost in every IDP lineups. I think that adding to their to the Geno Smith sack total is not out of the question at all. I think they can absolutely get home a plenty this week. Who knows? Geno Smith has been terrible right now. By the end of the year, I hope we maybe get like a pic of Geno holding up a sign for how many sacks he's taken this season. Maybe wearing a house coat, but no. Okay, I can't. All right, moving on. Denver's linebackers. We had the return of the Kingleton last week, so that was great to see. I could have definitely gone. I think it definitely could have gotten better for Geno Smith, right? For IDP at least, right? Because The defense was on the field for like 90 snaps, and somehow Singleton didn't even hit double digit tackles. So that was really kind of out of character for him, especially in a great matchup last week. We definitely expect more, is what I'm trying to say, right? Like we'll treat that kind of level of inefficiency as kind of an outlier for him, because yeah, anybody that knows the Kingleton lore will know that he's much more effective than what we got in week 13. Sadly, it is a poor matchup. So, expectations are more of an LB2 this week, but still like Singleton quite a bit. Drake Greenlaw, still the clear LB2 there, not a full-time role, so he's deep league only. Denver's defensive backs, Talanoa Hufanga has been great all year. He was a tackling machine last week. He's really kind of pulled away from Brandon Jones, who had that resurgent year last year. Now it seems to be Hufanga's turn, and he's been a locked-in weekly option for us every week, even in a below-average matchup here. All right, on to the Raiders, their defensive line. We talked about high expectations for Max Crosby against the Chargers last week. He definitely delivered with 2 sacks. We also talked about how he hasn't landed a sack in back-to-back games all season somehow. And unfortunately, I worry that trend might continue this week because he gets the toughest pass rush matchup in the league against the Denver Broncos, Bo Nix as well. Last time that Crosby faced the Broncos, he finished with just a 66 pass rush grade, which was below his season average for sure. Just 4 pressures and no sacks in that game. So obviously it's hard to bench him considering he doesn't leave the field, and we know the upside is always there, but he'll be kind of, I guess, a low end edge 1 for me this week instead of like the top 3 option that he was last week, if that makes sense. Raiders linebackers, Devin White, he gets a below average matchup, but he keeps delivering this year. He's been solid, as crazy as that is to say for a player who we had written off for a few years now. A good example, right, of how opportunity matters all else for the linebacker position. And White hasn't missed a single snap this year. So that is the ultimate opportunity. We can start him as more of an LB2 this week. We'll avoid Landon Roberts and Jamal Adams since both of those guys played fewer than 50% of snaps last week. They're sharing that LB2 role. Raiders DBs, Jeremy Chin's locked in. We're not taking him out most weeks. It's another good cornerback tackle matchup for the Raiders here, but they only have one full-time cornerback, which is Eric Stokes, and he's not been very good for IDP. The rest are rotating a lot. And I know Caillou Blue Kelly is coming up with big plays to boost his totals, but he's incredibly risky to trust at like 50-ish% of the snaps each week. We don't want to fall into those kinds of traps at this point in the year. So just ignore Blue Kelly. And if he has a big game, good for him, but odds are he won't, and you'll be glad that he wasn't in play for you. On to Cincinnati and Buffalo. Let's start with the Bengals defensive backs. Dax Hill gets a nice matchup here for tackle potential against the Bills. Bills' second most tackles per game to the cornerback position. Hill has been a good IDP in CB required leagues this year, but he was getting much more work in the slot earlier in the year. But that has changed these past 2 weeks. He's moved to exclusively outside corner over the last 2 games. Obviously, the Bengals, they've been making changes to their defense. They've been trying to fix the disaster that it's been. So they're tinkering to see what works. And part of those changes have been pushing Dax Hill to the outside, taking him out of the slot. That's hurt his IDP value, I think, just enough to push him a little further down the ranks this week. But it is at least a good matchup this week against the Bills, who are, like I said, second in tackles per game to the cornerback position. It's a poor matchup for Jordan Battle and Geno Stone. They're just kind of low-end starters this week. Bengals linebackers, Barrett Carter really didn't do much at all last week against the Ravens. Demetrius Knight was actually more effective on a part-time snap share. That snap share, though, for Demetrius Knight, it did dip from 85% of snaps the week before to 70% this past week. So they're obviously still tinkering a little bit there. Carter's going to be the one that we trust the most, and he gets a top 10 tackle matchup this week to potentially bounce back. So I like him. Bengals defensive line. Look, again, the Bills, they adjusted last week in terms of pass production that kept the, whoever they played, Steelers, I guess, off the board. But yeah, the Bengals without Trey Hendrickson, I'd say have very little hope. So yeah, we can mostly avoid them outside of like 32 team leagues. Okay, Baltimore's linebackers. or not Baltimore. What the hell am I saying? Buffalo. Buffalo, we'll move to them. They're talking about their linebackers. Terrell Bernard, he did not land on injured reserve. So he has a shot to come back this week, though it does feel unlikely given that IR was like bandied about when he did get hurt. So we'll prep for Shaq Thompson to be the starter this week. It's a neutral matchup as far as tackles go, but Shaq Thompson's been the most effective linebacker tackler in Buffalo. So I trust him more than Bernard this year. Matt Milano, purely a deep league option since he's not full-time. Buffalo's defensive line, Joey Bosa finally picked up an injury. Sorry, that sounded like, I had been hoping for it or something. That's not what I mean. It's just shocking, I guess, that he's gone this long into the season before getting hurt, given his history, is what I'm trying to say. And I didn't even want to bring it up most weeks because I didn't want to jinx it. So unfortunately, he did pick up a hamstring injury that could cause him to miss some times. That'll leave us with just Gregory Rousseau as an option this week in a decent matchup against that Bengals offensive line and Joe Burrow. It's not like a must start, but DL2 type this week for Gregory Rousseau. And then the Bills defensive backs, Cole Bishop gets his second straight poor matchup for safety tackles. We saw how that affected him last week with a down game. Could be another one this week, though Joe Burrow did at least create more for the safeties in terms of tackle potential last week than was the case with Flacco. So I don't hate Bishop this week. If you want to plug him in, it could definitely work out, considering the quarterback change. Nice matchup for Teron Johnson as well this week, both for tackle potential and playing time, with the Bengals spending a lot of time in 11 personnel. We highlighted it was a bad matchup for Teron Johnson last week. We avoided him. That worked out. I'd be fine going back to him as a CB required starter this week in a good matchup. All right, Rams and Cardinals. Rams defensive backs. They went pretty much full rotation with their DBs this past week. So that is probably due to them not trusting anybody outside of Quentin Lake, since Quentin Lake is injured. Cam Curl, he was fine. He stayed in his full-time role, so that was good at least. But the rest of the group, including Cam Kinchins and the slot guys, Kobe Durant and Josh Wallace, they were all part of a rotation. So Cam Kinchins, he rotated with Jalen McCullough in certain situations throughout the game. And then Durant and Wallace kind of split that slot role. So basically all the non-Cam Curl DBs are avoidable this week. Maybe Emmanuel Forbes. He was the only other full-time starter, and that was at outside corner. And he could be a fine streaming option in CB required leagues because it is a good matchup. Rams linebackers, Nate the Great Landman gets a nice matchup. He should be a locked-in starter for us this week. Omar Spates, just for deeper leagues. Spates actually got all the way up to 85% of snaps last week, so we'll keep an eye on if that was more of an outlier or a trend. Again, they were playing around with their DBs a little bit, so maybe that kept Spates on the field a little bit more. Spates has typically been around 60-ish% in recent weeks, but either way, he'll remain a deeper league option. But if it holds at like 85% of snap, then it at least increases his viability a bit. And Rams D-line, Byron Young broke his sackless streak last week. Hooray. Jared Verse was unable to build on his 2-sack game in week 12. So this week, nothing really scares you about this matchup against Jacoby Brissett and the Cardinals offensive line. So they've had a rough go of it in terms of matchup lately, Verse and Young, but this one is a better matchup for sure. So higher expectations from that duo. And then Kobe Turner, Braden Fisk as well for DT required leagues should be more usable if needed. All right, almost there. Arizona and their linebackers. Let's start there. We get one more week, or at least one more week of Cody Simon before Mac Wilson is technically eligible to return. Sadly, it's not a great matchup for Simon to potentially go out on. He's not exactly been, Expedition 33 Simon coded, more like just your, average bloke named Simon. Shout out to any Simons watching or listening. But no, I do love that. Simon, such an average name, not something like, overly badass like Sephiroth or the Nameless King or anything like that. I just appreciate how sometimes in these games, like JRPGs specifically, every once in a while, they'll give you this total Giga Chad who just has like a boring, bland ass name like Simon in Expedition 33, and it's like the hardest boss you've ever faced. Like even like right now, like playing Legend of Dragoon, Lloyd, total badass, regular name. Seymour is an awful name in Final Fantasy X. Apologies to any Seymours watching. But it's not necessarily like these final boss type names. Like what are they? Like Gendorf or something like that. Like I always just find it amusing that they are just like everyday names, but they're godlike powerful. But anyways, Simon, as in Cody, will be a low end starter this week. Akeem Davis Gaither for deeper leagues. But yeah, shout out any more fun boss names in the comments if you got them. All right, Arizona's defensive line. Josh Sweat, he's been so good this year that he has now tied his career high in total sacks with 11. It's not an easy matchup this week against the Rams. It'll be the first matchup of the year against the Rams and Matthew Stafford for him. So we'll see how it goes, but Stafford has been excellent at avoiding sacks this season. I still don't mind Sweat, but more of a fringe starter this week. Arizona's DBs, Buda Baker should definitely be in for another strong game here. Great matchup. Rams third in tackles to safeties. Jalen Thompson, definitely streamable again this week. I also like this matchup for the Cardinals cornerback, specifically Garrett Williams, who has moved into an every down role and will play in the slot. So great matchup for him to come through this week, since the Rams will play a decent amount of 11 personnel, but still Williams should stay on the field and get good tackle opportunities here in a positive matchup. All right, Sunday Night Football, Houston Texans, Kansas City Chiefs. Let's start with Houston's D-line. We talked about Will Anderson and Daniil Hunter. Unfortunately, they got shut out last week against the Colts. That was a tougher matchup after wrecking the Bills and Josh Allen the week prior. So it's fine. We'll keep starting them. You know, it's a tougher matchup again against the Chiefs, but we're going to trust in the talent to overcome more often than not. We can temper expectations for them, but unless you have other elite pass rushers, you're not sitting these guys. Houston's linebackers, Azeez Al-Shaair gets a nice matchup this week. He did leave last week's game for a short period to get checked for concussion, but he cleared the protocol, so he's fine to go this week. He hasn't been a great IDP this year, but a fine option in a positive matchup at least. And then Henky Two Toes, aka H2O, Henry To'o, also played that clear LB2 role again for the second week in a row. TBD if that actually holds, but at least it's enough of a trend that we can trust him in deeper leagues this week in a good matchup if you need him. Houston's defensive backs, Jalen Petrie did return to the lineup last week, and like we talked / warned about last week, that meant that Jalen Reed lost his starting role. It was only Petrie and Bullock playing full-time snaps at safety, Petrie getting kind of the clear best usage of that. Bullock played exclusively deep, so he's a much riskier option for IDP. Petrie is back to being a solid IDP starter for us. Not a great streaming matchup for the Ronso Kamari Lassiter this week. We've been relying on him as kind of a matchup dependent option, putting him in good matches, and he's done well, taking him out in bad matchups, and he's usually not doing as well. So find a pivot for another potential streaming option this week. Kansas City, their linebackers, Nick Bolton, nice matchup for him. I think I got him as a top 5 ranked linebacker this week. He has consistently delivered as a tackler for IDP managers. I think to trust him to come through in a big spot this week. He owns a pretty strong 15.4% tackle rate this year. Texans are giving up the 4th most tackles per game to the linebacker position. Bolton, he is just inside the top 20 of IDP scorers for the linebacker position, but it's not because he's a bad tackler, right? It's more just because he has a lack of big plays. That's something that mostly can't be helped, right? Like there's a lot of luck involved in landing big plays at the linebacker position specifically, right? We talked about this plenty of times, but yeah, it's entirely possible too. Like Bolton is due for some positive regression in that regard, and he at least has one of the better tackle floors for the position, so should be, I think, a strong weekly option here, not just this week, but through the fantasy playoffs as well. Kansas City's defensive line, George Karlaftis has kind of cooled off in recent weeks, really hasn't done much, which, you know, he should at the very least give us a fine floor considering his playing time, but it happens. This week, him and Chris Jones are on the low end of starting options for their respective positions, given the matchup. The Texans have made it tougher on pass rushers this year by leading the league in plays with 6 offensive linemen on the field. And then also CJ Stroud has greatly improved from last year in terms of his pressure to sack conversion rate. So those guys are startable, Karlaftis and Jones, but they're on the low end with some, potential streaming options maybe ahead of them. Kansas City's defensive backs, Chamari Connor, he's the main one. And as much as, Chiefs fans told me that he'd be benched soon early in the year, he's still going strong, racking up IDP production. Really nice matchup for him this week. So he's locked into lineups. Brian Cook picked up an injury last week, so we'll see if he's good to go or not. Otherwise, it might be Jaden Hicks as a streamable option in a good matchup as well. And then also Trent McDuffie, a solid CB required option. All right, final game of the week, Monday Night Football, Philadelphia Eagles, Los Angeles Chargers. We will start with the Philadelphia defensive line because the Chargers offensive line has struggled a lot to keep Justin Herbert from being pressured. Herbert still leads the league in total pressure dropbacks with 190. There has not been one good pass blocker on the Chargers offensive line this season, which has basically just opened the door for guys to get after Justin Herbert. This week, that includes Jalen Carter. He should absolutely be in play for DT required formats. Jalen Phillips, also a strong streaming option this week against Trey Pipkins. And then Jalix Hunt, he once again outsnapped Nolan Smith by a pretty significant margin last week, 70% to 39%. So Hunt might be the preferred option again, but slightly riskier because they've been moving that role up and down depending on how Vic Fangio feels about Smith. But that's an interesting one to keep an eye on. But Jalix Hunt, much more streamable than Nolan Smith is this week. Philadelphia's defensive back. So Reed Blankenship, he played in the box more than he has all season last week in week 13. Obviously, that led to a big tackle game from him. He hit double-digit tackles for the first time this season. I think it was 14. Not sure if this was more like a matchup-based thing or if this will be Blankenship's new norm going forward. But on the chance that it's an outlier, I think we don't want to overinvest in Blankenship and play him over some of our locked-in starters because he's mostly been ineffective as an IDP this season. But it's a neutral matchup against the Chargers, but I'll put him as kind of a low-end DB2 this week. The usage is definitely something we'll monitor and could at least improve his rest of season potential if it holds. Cooper DeJean, definitely in for CB required leagues, and then Sidney Brown is in for Andrew Makuba as well, but deep league only. Linebackers for Philadelphia, it does seem that Nakobe Dean has officially regained his full-time role because Jihad Campbell did not play a single defensive snap last week, while Nakobe Dean played 94% of the snaps. So he is right back to being an every league option, really. And then it is a good matchup too for Nakobe Dean and Zach Bond, of course. Chargers ranked top 10 in tackles per game to linebacker position, so both guys should be in lineups for the most part. All right, Chargers defensive back. Sadly, Derwin James didn't have as good of a game as we'd hoped for last week. He did get a half sack, so kind of hit on that big play potential that we talked about with his usage in this now 3 safety look on defense. I'm still trusting him to deliver for the most part, starting him most weeks. Just, got to get more from him than what we did last week. Otherwise, he'll maybe start to fall in the ranks a bit, but it's King Derwin. We trust him to deliver for us. Chargers defensive line, Tuli Tuipulotu went off in a great matchup last week against Bonnie Blue and the Raiders. Most of the team did, right? Khalil Mack had a half sack. Sadly, it might be over for Odafe Owe, though. He was looking good in his first bit of time with the Chargers, but the honeymoon period has kind of dried up here. And as a result, he's fallen all the way down the Final Fantasy party member depth chart. And he is Quinnen now, who can no eat. It's an annoying, stupid mechanic, but no can eat for us in IDP either. Difficult matchup for this group this week. So Khalil Mack, Tuli Tuipulotu, really fringe starters at best this week. All right, and let's wrap it up with the linebacker position, taking a shit on Diane Henley, who has been one of the most inefficient tacklers among full-time linebackers this season, which is puzzling, I would say, for a player in a zone-heavy defense and getting like typical off-ball linebacker deployment for the most part. He did play 16 defensive snaps, which was 33% of his snaps on the edge last week, but that hasn't been the norm for him this year. He is really just kind of been a tackling outlier on the bad end of things, unfortunately, which has sunk his fantasy value. And now this week, he gets the Philadelphia Eagles, who have been the worst tackle matchup for the linebacker position this season. Just 12 tackles per game to the linebackers on the year. It doesn't bode well for an already inefficient Henley, so he should be avoided where possible this week. Denzel Perriman, as much as he's been a much better tackler than Henley, like he more than doubled Henley's tackle total last week, despite only playing 60% of the snaps. Henley played every snap, but we don't want to get too risky in a bad matchup with Denzel Perriman. So very deep leagues only. Remember, this is obviously a crucial week. Don't play around too much, but you guys know that. You've been listening all year, and don't need to remind you, but that is going to do it. Thank you all for tuning in, watching, liking, subscribing, all that stuff. I really appreciate it. So if you do want to check out more of my work over on PFF.com, you can do so with a PFF Plus subscription. You'll get the IDP Fantasy Report, IDP Rankings, Wide Receiver Man Zone Coverage Report, the Red Zone Report, all that fun stuff, player grades, everything like that. And again, we still have the promo code Holiday 30 to save 30% off a PFF Plus subscription. As always, feel free to ask questions in the comment section. I will do my best to answer them all. If you think we should do a live stream in week 16, let me know. That could be fun. It could also be a complete disaster, but only one way to find out, right? So let me know if that's of interest. But yeah, good luck to everybody in the final week of the fantasy football regular season. I hope you all make the playoffs. And until then, peace out.